You don't deserve that bonus. You should be grateful you still have a job.
Then you should be careful with the records you sign. I'll let the files speak for themselves.
You didn't earn it. The words landed flat, rehearsed, like a line he had used before and expected to use again. My $47,000 bonus was being withheld, effective immediately. No spreadsheet on the screen, no explanation, no discussion, just a calm reminder that the decision was final, and that arguing would only reflect poorly on my attitude. I sat there, nodding, while my mind replayed the numbers he refused to look at. Every KPI met, every target cleared. The performance report had already been signed, approved, and locked in the system weeks ago. Yet the CEO spoke as if those facts were negotiable, as if reality itself had missed a meeting and failed to keep up. I am Leon Foster, Senior Operations Director. I am the reason our metrics never spike and never crash. The reason investors describe our performance as reassuring. I build systems that don't need heroic speeches to function. He, on the other hand, loves speeches, culture, discipline, accountability, words that sound impressive when repeated often enough, especially by someone who never touches the machinery that makes them true. He leaned back and smiled, the kind of smile that signals authority rather than confidence, according to him. Performance was more than numbers. It was impact. It was alignment, convenient concepts, vague enough to bend when a bonus is involved. When I mentioned the signed report, he waved it away. Systems change, he said. Perspectives evolve. The meeting ended without resolution because, in his mind, there was nothing left to resolve. I was expected to accept the verdict quietly and move on. Grateful to still have a job. That was the part that stung most, not the money, but the assumption that silence was the same as agreement. Back at my desk, I pulled up the performance report one more time. Same title, same date, same approval chain, but one figure, buried deep in the summary, no longer matched the version I remembered. It was small, subtle, almost harmless, almost. That difference, I realized, was exactly where this story was truly going to begin next. If that moment made your chest tighten a little, you're not alone. Take a second to unclench your jaw, roll your shoulders back, and breathe out slowly. Stories like this have a way of hitting close to home. I'm curious, how did that scene make you feel? And where are you listening from right now if this kind of quiet injustice sounds familiar? Staying with me matters. Tap subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the facts start pushing back, because what changed in that report didn't disappear, it was just the first crack. The next morning, the silence felt intentional. My name was missing from the follow-up emails that usually landed in my inbox without question. Calendar invites moved forward without me. Decisions summarized after the fact. It was subtle enough to deny, obvious enough to feel deliberate, like someone quietly erasing fingerprints from a room I had built. I learned more from a whisper than from any executive memo. One of my team members stopped by my desk, eyes lowered, voice careful. He said the board presentation did not look like the version I had submitted. Same charts, same structure, but the conclusions had shifted. He apologized as if the change were his fault, then left before anyone noticed the conversation. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, but frustration kept climbing, feeding a suspicion I could not yet prove. I remembered a night 2 years earlier when our transaction system froze hours before a major client deadline, millions on the line, reputations at risk. I stayed, rebuilt the workflow, stabilized the numbers, and kept the contract alive. The CEO arrived the next morning, nodded once, signed the report, and accepted public praise for decisive leadership. That memory followed me into our next encounter. This time, he did not bother pretending. He called me a liability, said my presence complicated the narrative he needed to sell upstairs. According to him, performance was not about consistency or outcomes. Performance was perception. If leadership felt uncertain, results became irrelevant. It was said calmly, like a lesson I should have learned earlier. By the end of the week, the pattern was impossible to ignore. I requested access to the archived performance file and compared it against my local copy. What I saw stopped me cold. 2 reports existed under the same title and date, each approved, each official, yet quietly different. One reflected reality, the other rewrote it. That was when suspicion hardened into certainty. And I understood that the numbers had not moved by accident. I did not confront anyone yet. because questions require leverage instead. I watched who spoke, who stayed silent, and who suddenly avoided my office. The absence felt louder than any accusation, somewhere between irritation and resolve. I realized the exclusion was not punishment, but preparation. They were adjusting the story before anyone noticed the edits. That understanding sharpened my focus. I saved copies, documented access times, and waited. Doubt still pressed on me, heavy and unresolved, but it no longer blurred my thinking. If the company wanted to pretend there was only one truth, I would let them believe that, for now. The mistake they were making was assuming I would forget what the original numbers looked like, and that memory, stubborn and precise, was already beginning to point me toward consequences no executive briefing could quietly rewrite once the next step forced its way forward, inevitably. I stopped reacting and started observing. Arguments would only feed the story they were shaping. So I gave them nothing. I showed up, did my job, and let the silence settle. Control does not always look loud. Sometimes it looks like patience wearing a neutral expression. My system access was still active, which mattered more than anyone realized. Legacy permissions tend to linger, especially when no one expects you to use them. I opened the archived logs, the ones no executive ever reviews unless something has already gone wrong. I was not hunting for proof yet. I was mapping the terrain. Pressure followed quickly. The CEO pulled me aside and told me to move on, said dwelling on a bonus was beneath someone in my position. He framed it as advice, the kind meant to sound generous while drawing a boundary. Human Resources echoed the message later that afternoon, reminding me to stay professional and avoid unnecessary friction. I thanked them both and went back to my desk. That was when focus replaced frustration. Audit trails do not care about opinions or hierarchy. They record actions, not intentions. I filtered by document ID, then by access level, then by time window. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing. The report had been edited after my electronic sign-off, well past the system lock. That alone was enough to invalidate the narrative I had been handed. I traced the timestamps again to be sure. The modification occurred late in the evening, minutes before the board packet was finalized. No IT maintenance window, no automated process, a deliberate human action. My pulse stayed steady as I followed the trail to the account used for the change. It was not an engineer. It was not finance. It was an administrative credential tied directly to executive support, the kind of account created for convenience and rarely questioned. The same account that scheduled the CEO's meetings and managed his correspondence. The same account with permissions broad enough to quietly adjust a story without leaving fingerprints most people would recognize. I closed the logs and logged out carefully. Nothing about my expression changed when I stood up. At that moment, the conflict shifted. It was no longer about whether I had earned my bonus. It was about who believed systems could be bent without consequence. I understood then that I did not need to accuse anyone or demand explanations. The data had already spoken, and it spoke with a clarity no amount of authority could override once the right eyes were forced to look. All that remained was timing. And timing, unlike perception, was something I still fully controlled. That realization settled my breathing, narrowed my thinking, and marked the moment I stopped reacting as an employee and began operating like someone preparing a record, not an argument that would eventually speak for itself clearly. If you leave here, you will miss the most important thing. I shifted into collection mode quietly, without signaling intent. Emotional reactions were a liability now, so I compressed them and focused on sequence. Every action had to look ordinary, even boring. The safest work often hides inside routine. I started with the edit logs, exporting them in small batches during hours no one monitored closely. Then, I pulled emails that never explicitly ordered changes, but suggested them. Phrases like, clean this up or adjust for clarity, always sent late and never copied widely. I saved calendar snapshots showing when performance data was officially locked, cross-referencing them with the timestamps I already had. None of it proved anything alone. Together, it formed a pattern that could not be explained away as misunderstanding. Pressure increased as my silence stretched. The CEO warned me that my attitude was being noticed. He said future evaluations would reflect my willingness to align with leadership priorities. Meetings I once led moved forward without invitations. Decisions I had shaped arrived already finalized. Isolation was no longer subtle, it was instructional. People began treating me like a hazard. Conversations stopped when I walked by. Managers avoided eye contact. I was labeled difficult without being accused of anything specific, which was exactly the point. If I reacted, the label would stick. So I didn't. I kept collecting. The real weight came from what I found next. Buried in archived correspondence were fragments of similar disputes, each resolved quietly. A withheld bonus explained as restructuring, a performance score revised after submission, a payout delayed until the employee left. 3 names stood out, all competent, all previously praised, all gone within a year. Different departments, same mechanism. That discovery changed the emotional pressure from personal to systemic. I was not an exception. I was a continuation. The realization tightened my focus, but slowed my movements. When patterns repeat, exposure matters more than speed. The CEO escalated again, instructing my manager to document minor issues and reduce my visibility. HR reminded me that collaboration was a core value. I acknowledged every message and saved everyone. Their attempts to corner me only widened the record. By then, restraint required effort. I was carrying proof without acknowledgement, truth without permission to speak it. Still, I waited. Collection was not revenge. It was preparation. Each file, each email, each calendar entry became a layer of insulation against dismissal or denial. The story they were building needed silence to survive. Mine needed patience. And patience, carefully applied, was already beginning to feel heavier than anger, but far more dangerous once released. I filed the complaint on a Tuesday, early enough that it would hit inboxes before anyone could intercept it. I did not ask for $47,000. I did not accuse anyone of theft. I asked for a procedural review, nothing more. A confirmation that approved reports were not altered after sign-off. Framed that way, it sounded harmless. That was intentional. The reaction was immediate. The CEO called me disgruntled, said I was poisoning morale because I could not accept a decision. He warned the board that entertaining my claim would invite chaos. His language escalated quickly, shifting from disappointment to alarm, as if a quiet question about process were an existential threat to leadership. I stayed silent publicly and precise privately. Every response I sent was factual, brief, and documented. Anger sat behind my ribs like pressure, contained but constant. This was no longer about money. It was about watching a system protect convenience over accuracy and daring anyone to object. The board finally noticed, not because they cared how I was treated, but because risk has a way of getting attention where fairness does not. Legal asked for context. Compliance asked for timelines. No one asked how it felt. They asked what exposure looked like if my complaint were accurate. The CEO pushed back harder. He requested a closed session, framed me as a performance problem, suggested I was building leverage for a payout. I learned about this secondhand. Through careful phrasing and follow-up emails that assumed his version would prevail. Still, I waited. Controlled anger does not rush. When the board requested my documentation, I sent exactly what they asked for and nothing else. Logs, emails, lock schedules, clean, chronological, unembellished. I resisted the urge to connect the dots for them. Letting professionals discover patterns themselves is more persuasive than insisting they see them. A week later, the tone shifted. Conversations became cautious. Language softened. The board did not apologize or acknowledge wrongdoing. Instead, they asked for an external review, citing the need for independence and objectivity. It was framed as neutral, almost academic. That request marked the real turning point. An external review meant scope. Scope meant precedent. Precedent meant the story could no longer be contained by executive confidence alone. I closed my laptop that evening with my anger still intact, but finally aligned. Whatever came next would not be decided by who spoke the loudest in the room, but by records that did not care who signed paychecks. That was when I understood that restraint had done its job, and the process was now carrying the weight forward. I knew the coming review would widen cracks they could no longer patch, and I intended to stand still, say little, document everything, and let the structure they trusted most deliver the consequences they feared. Silence, this time, was louder than any accusation. This paragraph explains everything you are about to hear. The audit widened quietly, and with it, the tension shifted direction. What had pressed on me for weeks began to press back on everyone else. External reviewers moved through the system methodically, asking for files no one had touched in years and explanations no one had rehearsed. Meetings multiplied, voices lowered, confidence thinned. Their findings did not arrive all at once. They arrived as patterns, Report after report showed the same behavior, approved numbers adjusted after submission. Always downward, always tied to compensation thresholds. Bonuses labeled discretionary suddenly aligned with executive targets. It was not chaos, it was design. The auditors described it without drama, the way professionals do when facts speak loudly enough on their own. The CEO reacted the only way he could. He blamed process. He said controls were outdated, approvals misunderstood, responsibilities blurred. When that failed, he redirected attention toward human resources, implying procedural oversight and administrative error. Each explanation contradicted the last, but he delivered them with urgency, hoping volume could replace coherence. I said nothing. Silence had become my safest posture. Every word I withheld tightened the pressure elsewhere. People stopped asking me questions and started watching me instead. Unsure whether my quiet meant ignorance or certainty, I let them wonder. HR scrambled to defend itself, producing policy language and training records. Finance reviewed its approvals twice. Executives spoke about alignment and transparency in tones that suggested neither was present. The auditors kept asking the same questions, phrased slightly differently, waiting for consistency that never arrived. The tension peaked during a closed board session I was not invited to attend. I learned about it afterward through a clipped message requesting I remain available. That was new. Availability meant uncertainty. Uncertainty meant fear. Later that afternoon, board counsel joined a call with the auditors. The word he used did not echo or linger. He said it once, calmly, and moved on. Misrepresentation, not fraud, not mistake. Something deliberate enough to matter, restrained enough to investigate further. The room reportedly went quiet. That single word changed the dynamic. Suddenly, this was no longer about accounting practices or bonus structures. It was about how truth had been presented and to whom. The CEO's confidence fractured. Blame shifting stopped working once intent entered the conversation. I closed my notes and waited. Pressure now flowed outward, away from me, toward the people who had assumed silence meant surrender. I had carried this weight long enough to recognize the sensation of release. It did not feel triumphant, it felt steady. Small numbers had triggered big fear because they revealed something larger. Systems built to protect leadership had begun documenting its exposure instead, and for the first time since this started. I understood that I no longer needed to push. The process was doing that for me, applying force where voices failed, tightening until the truth could not slip free again. I was asked to attend the board meeting at the last minute, which told me everything I needed to know. When organizations correct mistakes quietly, they do not invite witnesses. When they correct them carefully, they do. The room was calm, almost sterile. The board chair spoke first, explaining that a review had identified an inconsistency in how my bonus had been handled. To resolve the matter efficiently, the company would issue the withheld payment and document the correction. No apologies, no explanations. Just language designed to close a loop. The CEO avoided my eyes. He looked tired, smaller somehow, as if authority had leaked out through a crack no one could seal. The document was placed in front of him, already marked. He hesitated, asked a procedural question, then signed. The sound of the pen was louder than it should have been. I was handed confirmation moments later. $47,000, scheduled, processed, done. I nodded once. I did not thank anyone. Relief would have looked suspicious. Satisfaction would have looked dangerous. I kept my face still because stillness was the point. There was one more item, framed as routine, an administrative follow-up required to finalize the review. Another document slid across the table, aligned neatly with the first. The CEO barely glanced at it. He was still focused on the payment, on restoring balance, on ending a problem he believed had just been solved. He signed again. No one spoke while the pages were collected. The board chair thanked everyone for their professionalism and said the company valued transparency. The word hung there, ironic and unchallenged. The meeting adjourned. I stood and left without looking back. In the hallway, my breathing stayed even. What had just happened was not dramatic, but it was irreversible. The second document authorized an action he had been warned about, one he assumed was theoretical, an independent step triggered by his own hand, by choosing speed over scrutiny. He had approved the next phase himself. The signature he thought ended the issue had expanded it. That was the quiet precision of process. No confrontation, no accusation, just alignment. As I returned to my office, the balance shifted completely. I had my money, but more importantly, I had witnessed a moment where confidence outran caution. That mismatch always leaves a record, and records. Once signed, do not forget who placed their name there willingly. I understood then why calm unsettles people more than anger ever could. There was nothing left for me to prove aloud. The paper would travel where I no longer needed to go. All I had to do was wait, remain visible, and let the consequences arrive without my help. Because the signature had already begun doing the work, I refused to rush. Silence now felt deliberate, permanent, and far heavier than any threat he had imagined before signing. The notice went out before sunrise. Not announced, but felt. Systems lockouts changed, calendars froze, approvals stalled. Suspension does not arrive with noise, it arrives with absence. By the time I reached my desk, the decision had already started working its way through the building. The second document the CEO had signed was no longer theoretical. It authorized his temporary suspension pending an independent investigation. Effective immediately. No press release, no ceremony. Just a quiet removal of access and authority. The process unfolded exactly as designed, indifferent to reputation or protest. The investigation launched within hours. External counsel took control, issued preservation notices, and requested interviews. The board framed it as routine governance, but the speed betrayed concern. When institutions move quickly, it is not mercy, it is containment. The CEO did not accept it quietly. My phone lit up with missed calls I did not answer. His messages shifted from confusion to anger to threats. Each one shorter than the last. He spoke of lawsuits, defamation, retaliation. He promised consequences. I let the device vibrate itself into silence. Responding would have softened the edge he was now facing alone. Others ignored him too. Legal deferred, HR redirected, assistants stopped replying. Authority dissolves faster than people expect once it loses official backing. The building adjusted, doors opening for some and staying closed for others without comment. The auditors kept digging. What began as a review of altered reports expanded into performance incentives and executive scorecards. They discovered that adjusted numbers had not only reduced bonuses downward in certain contexts, they had been revised upward, selectively, to meet the CEO's personal KPI thresholds, the same mechanism, used differently, depending on who benefited. That finding changed everything. This was no longer a question of interpretation or process failure. It was self-interest documented across time. The board did not debate it, they did not need to. Patterns carry more weight than intent. I felt no rush of triumph. Satisfaction arrived colder, steadier. This outcome did not require my voice or my presence. It unfolded because systems were forced to speak where people had chosen not to. The fear that had once pressed inward now moved outward. Redistributed among those who had assumed it would never touch them. By the end of the day, the CEO's name was removed from shared materials, his meetings reassigned, his authority suspended between clauses and footnotes. The company did not collapse. It corrected course. I shut down my computer and stood. Aware that the tension had shifted permanently, the investigation would continue without me at its center. Exactly as it should. What remained was a quiet certainty that power misused leaves a trace. And traces, once connected, do not disappear. Cold satisfaction is not joy. It is the knowledge that consequences have begun moving on their own, no longer needing direction, and that the silence I maintained had finally been returned, amplified, and aimed elsewhere. I learned about his removal the same way everyone else did. Through an all-hands notice written in neutral language that could not hide its weight, the CEO had been asked to step down, effective immediately. His remaining compensation was under review. No explanation followed, because explanations were no longer required. The reaction across the company was quiet, almost relieved. People do not cheer when power collapses. They reorganize. Calendars reset. Decisions resumed. The absence where his authority used to sit was suddenly visible, and no one rushed to fill it. The clawback came next. His personal bonus, once justified by adjusted performance metrics, was formally rescinded. The auditors documented the sequence, the board approved recovery, and legal confirmed enforceability. What he had taken from others to polish his record was now stripped away with precision. Justice did not arrive loudly. It arrived correctly. News traveled beyond the building faster than it ever had inside. Industry contacts stopped returning his calls. Invitations disappeared. Articles used careful wording that said enough without saying everything. Reputation, once cracked, does not require force to fall. It simply loses support. I was invited to address the board, not as a victory lap, but as closure. I declined. Speaking would have shifted focus back to personalities, and this outcome was never about me. It was about restoring a line between truth and authority that should not have blurred in the first place. The final conversation surprised me. The board asked if I would oversee the transition, temporarily, to ensure continuity while a replacement was found. They framed it as trust earned through restraint. I accepted with conditions, clear scope, clear limits, clear documentation. Control without clarity creates the same problems it claims to solve. Walking back to my office, I felt something settle that had been restless for months. Not satisfaction, not relief, but recognition. The system had corrected itself, imperfectly, but visibly. People noticed, they adjusted. Accountability, once proven, reshapes behavior more effectively than fear ever could. The fall was complete, not because a man lost a title, but because a method lost protection. What remained was work to do and records to keep. I took the role offered, not as reward, but as responsibility. Justice, when seen, carries expectation. And expectation, properly managed, is how collapse becomes correction rather than spectacle. I understood that visibility mattered now, not as punishment, but as signal. The board wanted continuity, and I intended to give it without becoming what had just fallen. Oversight required distance, documentation, and restraint. Every decision would be logged, every change explained, every metric frozen at approval. This was not revenge. It was proof that governance could function when pressure replaced silence. The company would remember this moment, not as drama, but as a correction that restored trust slowly, deliberately, and permanently, leaving no room for quiet manipulation to return unnoticed again. I did not celebrate when everything finally ended. There was no surge of victory, no urge to tell the story again. The number sat quietly in my account, unchanged in meaning, detached from emotion. Money has a way of shrinking once it stops being used as leverage. People expected something from me, a smile, a comment, a sense of closure. What they received was calm. When asked how it felt, I answered honestly, it was never about $47,000. The sentence surprised some of them, but it was the only one that fit. The amount had merely revealed a flaw large enough to expose everything beneath it. Watching the company stabilize was more satisfying than any personal win. Processes tightened. Reviews slowed down. Approvals became deliberate again. The system corrected itself because it had been forced to look at its own footprints. Every shortcut leaves a mark. Every adjustment creates a trail. That is the part people forget when they assume power can smooth over inconvenience. I stayed long enough to finish the transition, then stepped back into my original role. Oversight ended where it was meant to end. Authority returned to structure instead of personality. No announcements were made. Stability does not need applause. On my last evening, I walked through the lobby alone. The building felt the same, but something subtle had shifted. On the executive floor, the nameplate outside the corner office was gone. Clean screws, fresh paint, no replacement yet, just absence. No one spoke his name, not out of fear, but out of irrelevance. The company had already absorbed the lesson and moved forward. That, more than punishment, felt like justice. As I stepped outside, the air felt lighter, not because I had won, but because nothing was pressing anymore. The story had reached its natural conclusion. Small greed had triggered a large collapse. Quiet systems had preserved the truth, and patience had done what outrage never could. I did not look back at the building. I did not need to. What mattered had already been recorded, archived, and understood. Somewhere inside, reports sat frozen exactly as approved, timestamps intact, waiting for no one. That was enough. Justice did not announce itself. It simply remained, visible, documented, and complete. That silence followed me home, steady and deserved, reminding me that fairness does not shout, it endures, quietly shaping what comes next over time always. What this story taught me is simple. Fairness doesn't need noise, it needs consistency. When you stay calm, document the truth, and let systems do their job, justice has a way of surfacing on its own. I'm curious, how did this story make you feel, and which moment stayed with you the longest? Where are you listening from right now if this resonated with you? Share your thoughts in the comments. A like or share helps these stories reach others who might need them. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, subscribing means a lot to me.